to do this presentation today. I have been teaching the art of perception for almost 10 years, and as Lange mentioned, it is a professional development course that uses art to improve observation and communication skills. I would also like to extend my thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities for their support of WNET's initiative called Picturing America on Screen. And what that is we are going to be creating a series of 20 short videos known as interstitials that feature the works of art in the Picturing America collection. And these short videos will be available on DVD, and they will be shown on public television stations between programs. We are in the midst of producing them now, and we're very excited to make these videos available as an educational tool to supplement ongoing Picturing America initiatives throughout the country. So I hope as they are developed, we will be able to get distribution information to you, to all the libraries that have Picturing America. As Lange mentioned about the art of perception, most of my training recently has focused on training law enforcement professionals, police officers, FBI, and Secret Service agents, but I have also used this methodology of looking at art critically with teachers and business executives. My goal today is to give you as librarians the tools to engage your audiences in the Picturing America images. They are compelling works of art that have great significance in the history of our country, and no background training in art history is necessary for this program. And today we're going to learn to analyze some works in this collection critically and try to understand in objective terms what makes them so compelling. It's a very simple model. We don't use the words obviously and clearly in the program, and I try to have the participants answer the following questions about each work of art. Who is the subject? What is happening in the work of art? Where is the place depicted in the work? Is it inside? Is it outside? Can you identify the place? Why did the artist create this image? And if you can identify, what is the time of day or the season? I ask the participants to pay particular attention to body language, eye contact, and nonverbal communication. I'm going to be working with about 12 or 13 images in the Picturing America collection today, and if I seem to be moving quickly, it's not because I want to rush through the presentation, but I find that in our daily responsibilities, especially with police officers and medical students, we don't have a long time to contemplate these images, so we try to distill the information as quickly as possible and get to the heart of what is going on in the object. There we go. Okay. The first image I'm going to show you is actually not in the Picturing America collection, but I wanted to give you an example of what happens when I show a work of art to a group of people who are not familiar with art and art history. I had a group of captains in the New York City Police Department about 5 years ago, and I thought I would introduce the model of how to look at a work of art by showing this portrait of Madam X by John Singer Sargent. It was painted in 1883-84, and I asked the group to give me a descriptive sentence about her using our model of who, what, where, why, and when. And the group of police officers started laughing, and I asked them what was so funny. And one brave soul raised his hand and said, "Miss Herman, that woman up there is reaching for a gun." And I couldn't believe what they were saying. And I said, well, can you be a bit more descriptive? And they said, in our line of work, if you can't see someone's hand, you assume they're reaching for a weapon. Well, never in my years of looking at Sargent's portrait at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and in textbooks had I ever considered that Madame Pierre Gautreau was reaching for a weapon, but I realized then that the participants in my program brought to the table very different eyes and experiences, and I have since that time tailored my program to realize that even if we don't all have art historical training, we can all look at a work of art, analyze the information, and draw conclusions.
Amy, we can't hear you. I'm not sure if you've got... There you go.
Okay, let me know again. I'm sorry if the, I don't know why the sound stopped, but I'll keep going. This is the iconic portrait of our first president. It illustrates his role as a leader and father of our country, but I'd like to look at the elements again in our model of who, what, where, why, and when. We have a white man, who's standing in the center of this portrait. He wears black clothing, black tights, black shoes, a white ruffled shirt with white cuffs, and he stands in the pose of an orator. His left hand is down at his side and his right hand is extended as if he is about to speak or say something. He is wearing a white wig, his cheeks are rather ruddy, and his gaze is averted. He's not looking directly at the painter or the viewer, but he is looking off to the side as if he is going to address a large group of people. In the room, we see that he is standing on a highly decorated rug. There is a chair behind him with, it appears to be red velvet on the cushions. There is a column behind him, directly behind George Washington's head, that is draped in a thick red velvet curtain. And it gives great architectural significance to the subject of the painting. He seems to be perfectly aligned with that great piece of architecture. And then to his right, we see what appears to be a desk or a table covered again in a red velvet cloth, and we see a pen and we see open books, and it's a very grand setting. He's in a classical pose of an orator, and it was in the grand European manner to depict nobility this way. But this is the father of our country, this is the first president in a very grand setting. And we know that the first presidency was a tumultuous administration. But for purposes of our exercise, we don't even have to put it in that context. But if you notice in the upper
Amy, we're losing your audio. At the bottom left, beside the talk button, you can click the button to the side of it to hold it down and keep it down.
Okay. Is that better? Now can you hear me again? Can you hear me now?
Yes, Amy, I can hear you.
And should anything happen, please let me know. Okay, so I will repeat, at the risk of repeating myself, for those of you who didn't hear me, we know that the first presidency, there were storms in the administration, but in the upper right-hand corner you see a glimpse of a rainbow, which could be symbolic that the storms in the administration have abated and that could be a sign of hope. But for purposes of our exercise, I don't even ask the participants to tell me why there's a rainbow. I just want them to identify all the images from the smallest detail up to the big picture. They can recognize who he is, but step back from the fact that this is George Washington and try to contextualize him within the painting. So I'm going to move on. And we are now moving to a different medium. And one of the wonderful things about the Picturing America collection is it uses painting and sculpture and photography and decorative arts, and it makes it very easy to apply this program. I've used many of the Picturing America images because we can talk about them in the media that they are in. And to compare this portrait of Benjamin Franklin to the portrait of George Washington, the first thing in our model of who, what, where, why, and when, it is a sculpture of Benjamin Franklin. But it is very different from the painting because it is in fact a marble sculpture. And everything about this portrait is as different from George Washington from the setting. I mean, here we see that Benjamin Franklin is standing in a much more relaxed pose. One leg is in front of the other, slightly bent. He's leaning on a tree trunk. His elbow rests on the tree trunk, and his chin, his hand is brought to his chin in what appears to be a contemplative gesture. His gaze is downward. We can see his midsection protruding from his jacket, and his hand rests at his side. His right hand rests at his side in a very casual sort of gesture. This is a larger-than-life sculpture, and yet the feeling that we get from it is very different, again, from the portrait of George Washington. Interesting things to note, some visual details about the sculpture that are particularly interesting. The tree trunk on which Benjamin Franklin is resting his elbow is scored by lightning. And the curve of the notches in the tree and the curve of that score of lightning very nicely counterbalance his right leg that is extended in front of the body. There are so many lifelike details. Again, the fabric of his coat, one can almost get a sense of how heavy the frock coat is, and if you look down at his ankles, and it may be hard to see in this slide, but the cotton of his hose is creasing at his ankles. And then if you move to the top of the sculpture and you look at his triangular hat, it's a very smooth surface and makes a beautiful contrast with the lines of Franklin's face, which have been very realistically depicted. So this is as I mentioned, it's a marble sculpture. It was commissioned by the United States government for the United States Senate, and it sits at the foot of the east staircase in the Senate wing. And again, just for purposes of comparison, if you look at the formality of the pose of George Washington, and then you look at the marble sculpture and you think of formality in sculpture, and yet in this beautiful rendition of Benjamin Franklin, there is an informality, there's a casual pose, a contemplative pose, and just by adding that tree trunk where he rests his elbow changes the whole nature of the sculpture. And again, most people know who Benjamin Franklin is, and that he was known for his book of experiments and observations in electricity, which is the reference in the tree trunk that was scored by lightning. But even without those contextual details, everyone can bring observational skills to this sculpture. And it's a very interesting piece to look at in this exercise. Now, staying in the genre of portraiture, I am now moving to the medium of photography. And here we have a photograph of 1885, Alexander Gardner's photograph of Abraham Lincoln, again in the Picturing America collection. And here we see the 16th president seated, different from both Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. He wears loose clothing. He wears a black jacket, a black vest, a white shirt with a bow tie that is slightly askew, and we see the chain of a pocket watch. He is sitting in the chair wearing black pants with his legs crossed. He fingers his glasses in his lap, and his gaze appears to look right at the photographer. Abraham Lincoln is only 55 years old in this portrait, but I always ask the participants, whether they be doctors or police officers or teachers, to guess how old the subject would be, and you'd be amazed at the range of ages that you get in someone's description of a portrait subject. Now, we know that Abraham Lincoln was the president during the Civil War, and in this particular photograph, you can see his haggard features, his deeply lined face. His beard is not particularly trimmed, and the way he's looking at the photographer, his right eye and cheek are in shadow and almost look cavernous. His right shoulder is lower than his left, and his elbow leans on the table. And again, following our model of who, what, where, why, and when, we see that the president is sitting in an interior. He sits at a table with a chair, but there are no other details to define the room. So the portrait is all about him. Now, if you notice very carefully, his hands fingering his glasses are slightly blurred, which gives the sense of possible motion. Perhaps he's fidgeting, perhaps this portrait took a long time, but it's a little more Lincoln loved photography. Just as a fact that I've learned through Picturing America, there were over 35 portraits of him that were circulated during his campaign of 1860, and you can see in this photograph's immediacy how different it is from the portrait of George Washington, how much more accessible it is. He looks like a humble country man sitting in a chair having his picture taken. It's interesting to note that this photograph was not originally intended to stand alone as a work of art. It was to be used by portrait painters to paint the portrait of Abraham Lincoln because he didn't have time to pose. So this photograph was taken as sort of an intermediary step to a portrait, but it ended up standing alone on its own as a portrait. And if we try to discuss the elements that make it so compelling, his dead-on gaze and just his informal pose make him a much more accessible figure. We also bring our own history of knowing the Civil War and the president's role in the Civil War, and there is a haggardness, a sense of exhaustion, and he seems to embody the weariness of the long Civil War. I should also tell you that when I conduct this program, which is a museum-based program, I don't do most of the talking. I have the participants articulate their observations of a whole variety of works of art. Okay, we're going to change gears now and leave portraiture for a few minutes and move on to a painting of 1929. This is The House by the Railroad by Edward Hopper. And I should also note in my program that we don't read the labels. We really don't discuss the works of art in terms of artist or art historical context. We really focus on them. We compare and contrast the works of art based on the subjects and the details, not necessarily who did them and their time period. And this is a solitary structure. It's actually a portrait on its own, but it's a portrait of a house rather than a person. So I thought it was an interesting segue to enter into looking at some of the landscapes in the Picturing America collection. This is a large gray house with a double-pitched roof that seems to showcase the attic windows. There is a double veranda and a tower that suggests that there might be a view, or there might have been a view of the surrounding landscape, but that view, we are barred from seeing that view. All we see are the railroad tracks at the bottom of the picture. This is not an anecdotal picture. It is a solitary structure in an undefined landscape, and the entire picture is cut by the railroad tracks below it. The sunlight illuminates this house very, very brightly, and it casts deep shadows in front of the tower. The shades, we see that there are shades in many of the windows. Some of them are partially drawn, and it raises the question, are there people in this house? We don't see any people when we're looking at the who, what, where, why, and when. We say that the subject of the painting is really the house and the railroad tracks. We don't see any people. And it brings up the question of whether this house is deserted or are there people on the veranda and we just can't see them. Very interesting also is the sense of sound. When we looked at the portrait of Lincoln, there was a sense of sadness and just a solitary figure. And similarly, we have the solitary house here and the railroad tracks, but one gets the sense that a passing train might rattle the windows, but you wonder if there's anyone to hear them. There's a suggestion of noise and a suggestion of a train, but the painting itself is quite silent. There's almost an eerie sense of isolation in this painting, and yet if we were just to describe the details in the house and the train tracks without even mentioning Edward Hopper and his style. It's not that there isn't a place for the context and Edward Hopper's important place in American painting, but for purposes of this exercise, we step away from our background in art history and really look at the objects for all of their visual details and attributes. And moving into another landscape, this is Grant Wood's The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, dating from 1931. Now, many people most Americans are familiar with the story of Paul Revere's midnight ride from Boston to Lexington, alerting the people to the British advance. And this painting is very interesting because it illustrates the scene in a very interesting way. First of all, we have a bird's eye perspective. We are looking down on the scene. And again, the who, what, where, why, and when model that I like to use. What do we have? We have a setup of a town, and we see the houses, we see the church, and they seem to be unnaturally lit for nighttime. We can tell when this is because when the painting takes place, it's the midnight ride of Paul Revere, and in the recess of the painting, you see the darkened countryside. And here, exactly, I'm seeing lights of perspective and light and motion and distance. You might have a full moon. I see the notes here. Absolutely, but it almost seems too bright to be realistic. The light stops and it highlights Paul Revere's ride. And if you notice Paul Revere on the side, a full moon, yes, I see that it could be that bright. But as Paul Revere has come down this path, the houses have been illuminated because they've been alerted to the presence and the British coming. And notice how bright those windows are. And one has to wonder, could candles really illuminate the houses that brightly? And also, I draw your attention to Paul Revere in the lower right-hand side of the painting. He almost appears to be a figure on a rocking horse, considering that this is the subject of the painting, is the midnight ride of Paul Revere, and he's this tiny figure off to the side, and yet it's his path of illumination that has really set the scene for this entire painting. So it's a survey of a vast sweep of the countryside in this very interesting bird's eye perspective, and I like to look beyond the illuminated scene. And yes, I see your notes. It's very, very stylized, highly stylized, and I think that is deliberately done. But that carries over into the background of the painting as well. Notice those perfect spheres of the green trees. And they contrast so starkly with the town in the moonlight. You have this very dark forested area from the area where Paul Revere came from, and where he's riding to was also dark, and that just exaggerates his alarm and how he's going to be the hero and light up the town and tell everyone of the advancing British troops. So this is really a wonderful painting. And it's almost toy-like. The buildings almost appear to be toys. And just in its visual style, if you remove the story, but again, everyone knows the story, so it's too tempting not to contextualize it. But it's really a wonderful example of how we can illustrate, we can discuss and articulate all the elements that make it so compelling, and why people like to look at this painting so much. Okay, and speaking of activity, I thought we would segue into Child Haslum's Allies Day. Different war, different time. This is May 1917. And rather than the ride of Paul Revere, which was the symbolic center and subject of the painting, here this painting is divided into two. It seems to be divided almost down the middle. On the right side, we have a whole flurry of banners and flags. We have all in red, white, and blue, American, British, and French flags. And on the left side, we have beautiful facades. You know, I would stop someone if they use the word beautiful. And we have the facades of buildings that appear to be in New York City, which in fact they are, and sunlight appears to be reflecting off of these buildings. And in the center of these two panels, we have activity. We have many figures. We can't see the figures specifically. We can't see what they're wearing, so it would be hard to tell what the season was based on how people are dressed. But again, our model, we can see that it appears to be morning, bright sunlight. Question, I'm going to interrupt. You said, why stop someone if they use the word beautiful? It's a good question, and it happens often. One of the objectives of this course is to try to make a distinction between observation and inference. So I try to encourage the participants to use as objective language as possible. There's nothing wrong with the word beautiful, but beautiful is a very subjective term. what's beautiful to me isn't necessarily going to be beautiful for you. So if one of the participants uses the word, I ask him or her to explain why they think a particular aspect of a work of art is beautiful. So I ask them to go behind their conclusion. I use that with subjective terms. I will stop people and say, well, what do you mean by that? And art gives them, it's a very non-threatening vehicle because everybody sees something, they can point to something, and they can explain what their conclusions are. So that was a good question. And in this, back to this painting for a minute, we were talking about the sunlight, the light reflecting off the building, and this painting, Haslum was trying to illustrate a historic occasion and symbolize this sense of nationalism at the time by using flags as the symbol. And the flags, interesting, someone just noted, I get the feeling of cold from this picture, and I was just going to say, you get a sense of wind blowing. There's breeze, there's momentum. It's a dynamic picture because of the sense of movement. The facades aren't moving, but those flags are really loaded symbols, and not just for their sense of nationalism, but as physical symbols. And it takes place in May, and it's interesting to note, again, in the teaching resource from Picturing America, Haslum did over 30 paintings of New York streets with banners and flags, and this particular location has been identified as Fifth Avenue at 52nd Street, but even if we didn't know that, again, the sense of flags and movement and people and sunlight really makes for a wonderful discussion. And yes, I agree with you, the cool colors really imbue the whole picture with a wonderful sense. I'm looking to see, nothing wrong with enjoying the beauty, but in teaching discussion, you want to get more specific. Exactly, why is this beautiful to me? What is beautiful about it? And even more specifically, how do we define what beautiful is for a specific image? And again, it's very, very highly subjective. Okay, I appreciate these questions and comments. These are terrific. Okay, we're going to move to another terrific image in this collection because there's so much activity and there's so much to look at. I'm going to experiment with using a highlighter, and hopefully it will work. This is George Caleb Bingham's painting, The Country Election, dating from 1852. And at first glance, if I didn't tell you the title was, I'm sorry, not country, it's The County Election, I'm sorry. The County Election of 1852, one would have to look very closely to realize that this is, in fact, a scene of democracy, that voting is happening. It could be a raucous party, for all we know. If you look to the left of the painting, there's a man serving drinks, someone is sitting back and drinking, and there are all kinds of, two boys are sitting in the front playing a game. There are men in different groups, and it would, one would have to look very carefully to recognize that this is actually an election. At this time, well, I'll get back to the history after we talk about the visual elements. Conspicuously absent from this painting are any images of women, and there is only one African-American man that one can see all the way on the left side. I'm going to try this arrow. Does it work? No? Okay, well, I tried. Okay, there's a man on the side, but there are no women on the scene, because women did not have the vote. If you notice up at the top of the steps, there's a man in orange. He has his hand on a Bible. He appears to be swearing. He is swearing that he has not cast his vote before. Directly behind him is a man in blue tipping his hat who appears to be a candidate. And the artist himself has inserted himself into this painting. He is sitting, let me try the highlighter again. No, it doesn't seem to be working. Oh, there it is. He has inserted himself right here in the painting, and he's either, it's hard to tell if he is sketching and drawing or if he's tallying votes. We leave that up to the viewer. There was no system of voter registration at the time. It appears to be chaos. Even, and I love this image of this man directly behind the man who is seated and drinking at the table, is carrying a slumped over body up to cast his vote, showing that no one is missed in the voting process. Bingham, he painted a series of canvases celebrating elections in newly created states along the western frontier. And you can see the landscape in the back. It seems to be, there's a flat landscape. Appears to be the afternoon sun. We see high clouds, blue sky. It's a setting that makes the election itself very brightly lit. I see the dog too had a vote. Interesting that the dog, I don't know if all of you see the dog, I'm going to try to point the arrow at the dog right here. He's at the feet of the artist, and perhaps he's showing fidelity to the artist. But no, I think it's very interesting that he is actually in the center of the painting. And then off to the side on the right, you have a man whose bandaged head, he's hanging his bandaged head over to the side. And, you know, I don't know if that's a suggestion of violence. Over here, can you see? Can everyone see the arrow now? Okay. Whether it's a suggestion of violence, or perhaps he is lamenting the fact that his candidate is losing. But there's a lot of activity, and again, when I work with the riot squad of the FBI, or I work with the violent crimes unit, they distill this visual information very quickly to get to the gist of what's happening. And I always find it very interesting that in a complicated painting with a lot of visual imagery, with no background in art history, they're able to get to the heart of the matter. And this is really a wonderful painting for its historical value, and of course for its historical and contextual value, but just on a visual level, every time I look at it, I see other things in the painting. Really, really wonderful. And it's a great painting to discuss with children, because they see all sorts of things, and they're not worried about democracy, but they see all kinds of things that I never get a chance to notice. Okay, and now we're shifting gears again. I tried to get as wide a cross-section of images as I could to demonstrate that this methodology can be used with any kind of art. And I'd be happy to talk about this at the end of the presentation. When we talk about the Richard Diebenkorn image, I use the methodology with abstract art as well, so it really works very nicely. The image in front of you now is Augustus Saint-Gaudens Robert Shaw Memorial from 1884. And again, how different it is not a painting, it's a bronze relief. And this is a relief that has a number of figures in the background carrying bayonets. There is a prominent figure in the foreground riding a horse, and at the top of the bronze relief, a winged figure appears to be flying over the entire infantry, the entire group of soldiers in almost a protective sort of way, and that figure has its hand extended out as if guiding the troops on their mission. This work is done in very realistic style. I realize it's hard to see in this slide, but I also wanted you to see in situ how this bronze is surrounded by trees. It's almost like an altar. You're on the sidewalk and you look up at this bronze sculpture. It's a stoic procession of soldiers. They're portrayed as a group of individuals, and when you look at the individual bronze figures, their uniforms are ragged, but their faces are individual. The artist produced 42 different heads, didn't use all of them, but has very individual figures. And this is a memorial that is dedicated to a group of citizens rather than to a single war hero. And it's Shaw's regiment. It's Robert Shaw's regiment. Excuse me, I'm just taking a sip of water. And I note the historical context here because it's very important to the visual aspects. Shaw's regiment led an attack in Fort Wagner, South Carolina, but the mission was ultimately doomed. This was the first regiment of African Americans recruited in the North to serve in the Union Army. And the reason I make note of that, many of these volunteers enlisted at the urging of Frederick Douglass. And even though the mission was doomed, I believe 281 soldiers from the unit were lost, this is still a victory memorial. Notice there the dignity and the confidence with which these figures all move forward. The horse and the beautiful diagonals of the bayonets, and how that whole infantry is united behind its leader as they move forward. And never would you know from looking at this memorial that they were moving forward to defeat. It was actually, Lincoln noted that the added African American troops actually turned the Civil War, and he pointed to this battle as one that positively affected the outcome of the war. So although the battle itself was a disaster and there was a great loss of life, and Robert Shaw died and was dumped into a mass grave, it's a victorious memorial because it celebrates the African Americans that were and commemorates this 54th Massachusetts Voluntary Infantry. And it's so stoic and interesting. The comment said, it is still moving today. I couldn't agree with you more. You stand in front of this memorial and you have a sense of marching along with them. It's really a very, very compelling work of art. And again, even without that historical context, you can ask people, what is so moving about it, both figuratively and literally? And the fact that it's bronze, it's not sculpture in 3 dimension. You can't walk all the way around it, but it is a relief and it comes off the surface. And to talk about people how that's different from looking at a painting of soldiers marching. It's very compelling work of art and very, very interesting. Okay. Please keep the comments and questions coming. I think that's very interesting. To a different kind of march. I am now progressing to an incredibly iconic image of the civil rights movement. This is James Corrales' Selma to Montgomery March for Voting Rights, 1965. We'll start with the visual attributes of this photograph. This is an arresting image. We have figures moving from right to left. And if you look to the far left of this photograph, as if they are defying this oncoming storm, the 4 figures in the front march in unison and seem to set the pace for the rest of the line that goes as far as the eye can see. One gets a sense of momentum. And in the center of this line, someone is holding an American flag, and the top of that American flag almost seems to touch that cloud in the sky. And I couldn't help thinking when comparing the Robert Shaw Memorial with this, that this cloud is almost like that winged figure in the bronze that is escorting this group on their march to their destination. This was, as I said, it's March 1965, the historic 4-day march that concluded in Montgomery, Alabama. It began in Selma, 54 miles away, and the photographer covered the event for Look magazine. It's a timeless image. The force of the march, the flag, the impending storm, they're collectively symbolic of strength and ultimately the triumphant civil rights movement, but again, not even putting it in context, in the historical context, which of course is so important, but just for our purposes of looking, you can get a sense of the dignity and the confidence with which these marchers were moving forward. And again, just for purposes of visual comparison, go back to the Shaw Memorial. They're walking in the other direction, but that same sense of figures being upright and following a leader and marching with such determination that they have been memorialized in 2 very, very different artworks is really makes them iconic, one of the civil rights movement and one for the Civil War. So it's really, I think this is one of the most powerful images in the collection. And as with any of these images, we could talk about them for half an hour in terms of their visual attributes, but I'm trying to give you the tools to make them accessible to adults and to children who probably don't have background in art history. And the comment says, the marchers are haloed in light while gloom hovers over them. I think that's a wonderful description. This sense of a halo and gloom does hover over them. I see it more as a protective force, but the clouds seem to be hanging so low. But it's also interesting to note that the clouds and the marchers are separated by that band of light. And again, it's captured in this photograph that has really become a symbol of the civil rights movement. Okay. Speaking of another American iconic photograph, this is Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother of 1936. And I would imagine we are all familiar with this image, but I want to ask the question, and please feel free to chime in with questions and comments on this one. I want to look closely at the attributes of this photograph to find out exactly why it is so compelling. I use this photograph in my course all the time. And it is because of the title we know that it depicts a woman who is a migrant worker, but from just the visual analysis of the image, we can identify 4 figures in this painting: a woman, 2 children who are averting their gaze from the photographer, and a baby who sleeps in its mother's lap. The woman's gaze does not meet the viewer, and she is looking off into the distance. Now, we pay particular attention in this program to body language and nonverbal communication, and here this woman is making a seemingly unconscious gesture of anxiety, and her furrowed brow and deeply lined face bespeak her distress, even if we took her out of the migrant camp, because we really don't know from this photograph that she is a migrant worker. We see that there is a tent behind her, but it doesn't identify itself as her surroundings. We see her clothing, her children's clothing is unkempt. They're not particularly clean. But the older children, even though they are unkempt, they press against this woman for comfort, and she almost seems unaware of them. It's hard to believe that this woman is 32 years old, and she looks much older than that. Although, you know, she has brown hair, but her look of distraught and distress and the lines on her face make her seem much older. The comment here, she is distressed, but her strength comes through. There is a sense of strength, even though her shoulders are pressed forward. She is still supporting those two children that are pressed to her for comfort, and the sleeping child, she is sheltering that sleeping child. It's a very interesting image. Because Dorothea Lange was sent out to document the migrant workers at their campsites in California as part of the resettlement administration, she didn't know this woman's name, and she also didn't know that she was a full-blooded Cherokee. She was an Indian who was raised in the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, and I think very few people know that. And it's not necessary, we don't have to put it in that context, but her anonymity almost doesn't matter because her human condition speaks so loudly to anyone who sees this photograph. Her family, her children, it has become the way the Selma to Montgomery March has become an iconic image of the voting, the civil rights, the Voting Act. This has become an image of the Depression and of migrant workers. And again, we could talk about the visual elements for quite a while, but I think it is a compelling American image, and one that is easily discussed with audiences, because everyone, as with this program, as I've seen for years and years, everyone brings something to the table when they're looking at a work of art. Okay, I'm going to move on. We're really drastically shifting gears back to painting, and I'm showing you Joseph Stella's Brooklyn Bridge. And this painting, it takes a moment for your eyes to adjust, because the question as a viewer, you're asking, am I looking at a representational painting or am I looking at an abstract painting? And if it leans towards abstraction, let's step back and again look at our model of who, what, where, why, and when. What is this? We have a series of wires and cables and piers and arches, and the line and the form and the color, they evoke the idea of a bridge, but they don't absolutely accurately depict a bridge. You can get a sense of the Brooklyn Bridge, but there's a sense also, not in addition to all those visual elements that make up the Brooklyn Bridge, this painting is also imbued with a sense of tension. Now, I would ask the participants, what gives it a sense of tension? And some of the participants have said the colors and the different facets almost look like stained glass, and all of those columns and pipes and wires look like they're about to pierce the stained glass. Other people have said that there's a sense of tension in that it conveys too much noise, music, horns honking, and I like to think of it as urban cacophony, and I see the comment here, it looks like chaos. To some people, it does look like chaos. And if you spend time trying to sort out the colors and the forms and the lines, it still could look very chaotic to you. But it is, you get a sense, as a viewer, you could be walking or biking or driving across the bridge. for those of you that know it as a bridge, but if we don't identify it that way, how would we describe this in visual terms to someone who can't see it? Your comment says, it's busy, but the lines focus the eye on specific structures. Yes, it's hard to work backwards. It's hard to completely separate ourselves from the title and knowing this is the Brooklyn Bridge. But if you just showed the image to someone and said, what does this look like to you? How would you describe it? And one of the questions I like to use, how would you describe this image to me if I couldn't see it? Not an easy exercise to do, but it's a lot of fun, and it gets the participants to think about how they talk about what they're seeing. And this is one, I wouldn't use it right away. I wouldn't use it as a first example. I'd start with something a little more representational and something that's more concrete in its imagery, but working with this image, how does it create a sense of noise? How does it create a sense of tension? And what are the visual elements, what are the small details that make it interesting? And for the person who said it looks like chaos, how would you describe what chaos looks like to you? It's a very interesting image, very, very interesting. And even the use of red. Someone has said they thought it was traffic lights. It looked like traffic lights to them and the structure of traffic lights. Okay, we're going to stay in the semi-abstract world and move on to Richard Diebenkorn's painting, Cityscape 1. And again, you have to adjust your eyes after looking at the Brooklyn Bridge. You just have to step back. And that's something I always ask the participants. We don't talk for a full minute before we look at these works of art. They have to take all the visual information in without saying anything. And then we talk about what it is that we see. And here we have a picture that's a conglomeration of green and brown, gray ink, gray and blue patches arranged in what appears to be an aerial view. There are rectangles and stripes and triangles in a carefully composed geometric pattern. And it appears that bright sunlight is suffusing this image, but it's also casting deep shadows. If you think back to Child Haslums' The Allies' Day, 1917, how that was divided in two planes, this picture is similarly divided into two planes, and it's divided by a road down the center. To me, that road actually looks like you're riding up a roller coaster, but we'll get back to that. To the right is undeveloped, untouched, seemingly open landscape, and to the left, it appears to have buildings. Okay, can you hear me now? Sorry, I don't know how that happened. I apologize. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, good. I will try to, at the risk of repeating myself, again, the painting is divided into two sections, and it's the man-made side versus the undeveloped landscape side on the right. Diebenkorn's paintings often catch the eye with their light and shadows, and you feel somewhat tricked. You wonder, is this abstract? Is this an abstract painting or a representational painting? It really doesn't matter for purposes of this exercise. We can look at the shapes and the colors, and if you think back to the Edward Hopper painting of the house, that painting didn't have any figures in it, and neither does this one, but we don't seem to have the same sense of isolation and loneliness and even desertion that we had in the Hopper painting. So it's not a matter of paintings having people in them or not having people in them. It's a sense that's created by the painting. And this one, it seems to be full of activity, and that road down the center also gives you a sense of motion. That what is our perspective in the painting? Where are we? And here we appear to be looking down on this aerial view, and somehow the painting seems to be in motion. I will tell you that in the art of perception, using abstract works of art isn't any harder than using representational works of art. It just takes a different kind of articulation, and it presses the participants to think about how they are expressing themselves. But using these works of art, I really see a sense of joy that comes out because I'm not testing them, and there are certainly no right or wrong answers when we are looking at works of art, because everyone sees something, and I keep saying that, and everyone sees things differently. But if you stick to this model of who, what, where, why, and when, there are specific questions to be answered, and you can always guide the discussion even if you don't have a strong historical context or art historical context. this is also unique, just also in a historical context. Diebenkorn has done landscape paintings featuring the West Coast, and it's a unique light quality. And it's his whole collection of works, of his abstract works, portrays the light, the West Coast light, in a very unique way. And it's always interesting to use one or more of these works and ask participants to differentiate among these different abstract works. It makes for a very, very interesting discussion. Okay, and we are going to move to the last image, and that's going to leave us some time for questions. I think this is one of the most wonderful, for visual analysis and critical thinking, this image, you can't look at it and not have 100 questions run through your mind, and yet you can't stop looking at it. This is Martin Puryear's ladder for Booker T. Washington. It's a handcrafted ladder that is 36 feet tall, made of sinuous wood, and as you look up at it, it is suspended, and it's suspended from the floor, and as you look up, the steps become smaller and smaller, and the whole notion of functionality is turned on its head. Here, a ladder is used to, yes, I love this one too. I'm in agreement with all of you. A ladder is used to ascend to a place that one can't reach alone. And here that functionality has been taken away. You can't reach the ladder, you can't get to it. It's suspended 3 feet from the floor and is anchored to its surroundings by these undetectable wires. You can't step on it, and you really can't use it to climb anywhere. So what is it that makes this ladder so incredibly compelling, other than the fact that it's not really a functional ladder? It is the fact, and I have to tie it into the title here, because it is the ladder for Booker T. Washington. He was born into slavery and ascended to the position of founder and president of the Tuskegee Institute of Alabama, and his autobiography was entitled Up from Slavery, which is another reference to ascendancy. And the whole idea of upward motion, this ladder is certainly moving on its own. It seems to have its own sinuous curve and life and its suspension, and yet the idea of a ladder is really taken away from it. But unlike the other works that we've looked at in this Picturing America collection, the final interpretation of the piece is really left open to the viewer. It's about looking and experiencing this sculpture that endows it with a personal meaning for everybody who looks at it. And, you know, I've had people say, well, I don't get it. And I respond by saying, well, what is it you're trying to get? And then we get into a discussion of describing what they like or don't like about it. And it's really fine when participants don't like a particular work of art, but if you encourage them to articulate what it is about the work of art that they like and don't like, it becomes more meaningful for everybody. The whole goal of this exercise is to engage your audiences in a dialogue about art, so that it's just not a one-way, either it's not a one-way lecture, or it's not just looking at a work of art, it's talking about it. And that's what I find gratifying about the program, and bringing it to audiences in all different professions. And I hope that you will be able to bring these Picturing America collections, and I've just scratched the surface. I've only used 14 images today. There's a whole wonderful collection. I just wanted to get a representational cross-section to introduce you to this concept of thinking about how we talk about art and how we engage our audiences. So I want to thank you all for your participation, your great questions and comments. I'm happy to take additional questions if you have them. I'll read them aloud if you type them in. And also, I wanted to tell you, if you want additional information on the art of perception, you're welcome to visit my website at www.artfulperception.com. So I thank you very much. Okay, I appreciate the opportunity to hear. Okay, good. How to conceptualize, how to do a presentation. I'm glad. I really want to make this, to try to give you the tools to make this as accessible to your audiences as possible.
While all of you are thinking of questions you may want to answer, oop, there's an echo.
Oops.
Can everyone hear me now? Great. Okay, well, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and thank Amy. As she mentioned, her work teaching the art of perception really focuses very specifically on law enforcement agencies, but I think the simplicity of the discussion questions that guide her methodology really offer an interesting way for any audience to look at and talk about art. And even in this restricted online environment, neither Amy nor I was sure whether or not any questions or discussion would come through, but it did. I think it just really seems to come naturally and should lead very naturally to further discussion and investigation. So I hope that this session has provided an opportunity to consider some of the Picturing America images more closely or differently, and inspired a bit of thinking about how public libraries can not only display the collection but also discuss it with members of the community using the simple who, what, when, where, why questions that Amy mentioned. And if there are any other questions, I know Amy's available, so you can just submit them via chat. And thanks, Amy, and thanks all for being here.
My pleasure. I'm looking, oh, I'm excited. It gives you motivation to do Picturing America programming, which is great to hear. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I really can't emphasize enough how conducive these images are to engaging all kinds of audiences. And as librarians, you have access to so many different kinds of audiences, children and adults and people with all different levels of knowledge. But this I have found, I have even worked with art historians. So thank you, Wendy. Yes, there is an article in the October Smithsonian Magazine about me and my program. Thank you for bringing that up. It talks about my work with law enforcement and the work that I do at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for your participation.
And we can put a link up on the Picturing America for Public Libraries website also to link out to that article from the Smithsonian Magazine. It's a great article, and we'll get that up shortly.
Thanks so much.
And thanks, Amy.